Hi, my name is Uzodin Maiwala, and I'm the CEO of the Africa Center. You might have just seen me vibing out to our intro music a little bit, which is, I would say, pretty hot. But I'm excited to see all of you here today. And thank you for joining us for our program this morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world, The Books That Made Us 2021. It's a pleasure to partner with Brittle Paper, a leading online home for African literature, on this program. The conversation will be between Brittle Paper's founder, Ainehi Edoro, and literary academic Ellah P. Wakatama, and focus on Brittle Paper's list of 50 notable African books of the year. We're also delighted that South Africa's Mail and Guardian newspaper is a partner in making the list possible and is dedicating some pages in its printed newspaper to this wonderful list featuring an array of African and African diasporic authors. Please visit the news section of the Africa Center's website to learn more about it and to see the books included in it. As we head into the holiday season, I hope that you'll consider gifting one of our fantastic selections for the book lover in your life. At the Africa Center, our work is focused on transforming the world's understanding of Africa and its diaspora by centering human stories of the continent and its people in contemporary culture, policy, and business. We're bringing this program to you to encourage engagement with Africa's rich and diverse literary culture. So please be sure to follow the speakers to keep updated on their doings and to support their work. You can also keep in touch with us at the Africa Center by following us at the Africa Center on our various platforms. So once again, really excited to have all of you here, and I turn you over to our esteemed speakers for the program. Thank you.
Hi, Ella.
How are you? It's nice to see you.
I'm fine, thank you. It's nice to see you too. It's really special to share this space with you. You are a book lover extraordinaire. You care about books deeply. You curate books, you publish books, but you're also an exceptional reader, a careful reader of books. So it's all layers of honor for us to be able to share this book, just to geek out and nerd out about books that we loved this year.
It's so exciting for me. I look forward to this list every year, Nehi, and I think this year especially, there's such an abundance of excellent work that I found myself feeling a little bit like an old auntie, because I've reached that point where where so many of the writers are young people I met sort of, at a very early stage. And I just have all of this pride. I mean, so many of the books I don't have anything to do with, but I just feel this overwhelming pride. So thank you to you and your team for putting it together. It's so exciting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to talk about the list itself, what goes into curating a list like that. What's the significance of a list like that? Mm-hmm. And when we look at the list, because it's a kind of tableau, it gives us this broad sweep of the African literary scene at the moment. When we look at the list, what can we read from the list? What does it tell us? What signals does it give us about what's going on in African literature today? But before we get started, maybe a good place to begin would be to do a little retrospective and think about the year in general within the African literary scene. What's been most memorable for you as somebody who exists in the African literary world?
I think for me, I've been really excited this year just for my own reading to see this wonderful expansion of genre writing. And by that, I mean the crime books that I'm reading, the speculative fiction books that I'm reading. And added to that is the nonfiction, the creative nonfiction, because for so long our offerings have been what's been available to readers of who want to read writers from the continent has been literary fiction. We've been good at that for decades, for generations. What's exciting to me now is that there's a volume of speculative fiction that's drawing on all kinds of interesting traditions. But also in your list, we can see anthologies. And I also noting a book on climate change. I mean, all of these things are sort of tackling such universal issues and themes. It makes me really happy to see writers, and especially young writers, I have to say, from the continent, working across such a wide range. And, we haven't even got into poetry yet, but also to see some of the granddaddies producing exciting work. So, looking at, I know that so many of us were excited when Shoyinka's novel flooded with all of its volume onto our doormats. And that's certainly my first Christmas read. And then just mentioning Zake Sunda and Ben Okri with his children's book. So that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see a list that has Wale Soyinka, right, who was essentially at one of the beginning moments of African fiction, right, as a global form. He was there in the mid-20th century when African literature sort of went global. So to see him on a list with somebody like Namina Forna, right, who is in her 20s, she's on her first book, her second book is coming out next year, but she's sort of at the beginning of her career. It gives this list the true sense of a community of writers who cut across different, age groups, different literary styles, and who come from different parts of the continent. I find that really heartwarming.
So do I. And I think that also for me, what's really important is seeing books that are just so clearly commercial. The packaging. Ainehi, that's one thing I have to say. Looking at the list sort of in Technicolor, those book covers, there's some astonishing stuff there. And just sort of designs that are new. I mean, there are a couple of acacia trees. We'll forgive it for this year. Next year, no more acacia trees. But mostly it's really confident publishing. And that's exciting to me. And, because this is how I make my living, these are books that are going to make money too. And I think that's really important. I mean, we can think of the building culture aspect of it, which I know that for both of us is primary. But pretty much sort of, alongside that is that commercial aspect. And I think that is something that, one, encourages other writers, but two, it also means that the writers who are working now, if they can make part of their living from their work, it assures us that next year and the year after we'll have more and hopefully bigger lists to publish. I think those two things are really important. I have a question.
No, go on. You can ask your question.
I have a question for you. So when you start compiling the list, how many books do you have to consider? How are you ensuring that you're getting all of them?
This year we started with a list of 150. Which is different. It's gotten better and better every year. And thinking about this as an upward moving trend is very important. The first list was in 2018, and we had 48 books on the list. And I was scrounging around. I mean, it was hard to get to that number because there just weren't that many books in circulation, kind of doing the kinds of things that we look out for. Over the years, that has changed for two reasons. First, just because the market is different, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. What really has changed from, a few years ago and now? How is it that we are able to create a list like this in the first place? But the second reason is that we keep a meticulous book database at Brittle Paper. So all through the year, even 2-3 years in advance, we are already kind of keeping a very close record of books that are being published. And so when we started out this year, we had a ton of books to work through. We cut it down from 150 to 100, from 100 to 70. And then the journey from 70 to 50 was simultaneously exciting, but also just really stressful because all these books are amazing, right? So how do you take A out but leave B in? But yeah, I think a key part is also technological in the sense that we figured out a way to keep track of books that are published all through the year.
And then, you asked me earlier about what the year has taught us. And so I'm really pleased you brought up technology, Because this year and last year, certainly in my role as chair of the AKO Kane Prize, we found that connecting to all of the readers of the Kane Prize story and the wider literary community has become so important. And because our dinner, which is usually a relatively exclusive event, we had to do it online. So we opened up to everyone. And for me, it's been exciting to see how many people engaged with us. And that's one thing that's not going to change. And we found also, I found that I'm depending more and more on Brittle Paper, the various reviews, the Johannesburg Literary Review and so on, because we're not going to festivals or anything, or the festivals are all online. Mm-hmm. So I think that, our continent has got the youngest population, I think, in the world. And we are embracing technology in a way that even aunties such as myself can keep up. And that's also really exciting to me. It's how we disseminate this work and how we celebrate and actually valorize each other.
Absolutely. And thinking of technology and book production itself, you talked earlier about book covers, right? Now, Instagram is single-handedly responsible also for revolutionizing cover creation culture, right? I mean, okay, for those of you who do not know what Ellah was referring to when she mentioned acacia trees, a few years ago, there was something called CoverGate, which was published by Africa is a Country. Somebody did this amazing study of Western publishers' covers of African books and found out that they were all stock photos of women with head ties or acacia trees. And it went viral and, in a sense, set the tone for the shifts that we're seeing today. Right, African book covers today are amazing. Publishers are putting in the time and the money to create just delectable, beautiful covers. But then digital culture has also contributed to that a lot, right? Because you are competing with lots of amazing images on people's Instagram timeline. So the importance of covers to pop out and be colorful and rich, and almost eatable, is a huge part of book production today. And looking at the list, as Ellah mentioned, you can tell that these books are beautiful and gorgeous. But aside from these kinds of production considerations that is shifting the way we think about books and create books, I'm curious about what a list like this looks like to you, Ellah, as somebody who is inside the industry. So you're both a reader, but you're also one of the top people making decisions about what gets published, who gets published. What do you see in this list when you look at it?
I'm really happy you asked me that. There's one thing that I see. First of all, I just have to confess that my first feeling is envy, because I want every one of these 50 books to be one that I published. So there's just that. But then there's also, I guess, a true gratitude, because I came into publishing 20 odd years ago and really struggled for at least the first decade. One, as a publisher, but before that, even as a reader. Because one of the things you'll notice with the list, Ainehi, is that each of these books fits into a category. You can call them all African books, but they all fit into their own category and indeed subcategories as well. And for me, that becomes really important, because with this volume that we're talking about, it means that the writers aren't all pushed to the back of the bookshelf, to the bookstore, as they were 15, 20 years ago. But these books are all, I'm looking at Kaya Chingoni's poetry collection and looking at Ben Okri's children's book, and thinking that those books are all going to be put in those sections now. And for me, that's really important. And the other thing that I would say is this list shows us what we can do. Right. And for me, that's really important, because I can speak for myself and say that, this was something that frustrated me. So my work has been towards such a list as this. Obviously, one person can't take any credit, but I think it's really important for the writers, for the readers, the Instagrammers, the bloggers, that whole community you're talking about, to know that this change has happened, not because some publisher in New York or London noticed and wanted to publish, but because we have been working and insisting over the last 10, 20 years that our books have commercial potential, our books have cultural value. And we've also pivoted from asking for recognition to recognizing ourselves and each other. For me, that's power. It's also a celebration. That's what this list looks like to me. It looks like a list where I could, as Uzo was just saying, I could make my Christmas list, and I'm a magical book doctor. You probably guessed, but I could make my Christmas list and find a book for each person on this list, and regardless of who they are or where they come from. To me, that's exciting because that promises longevity for this moment we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of pointing to the importance of diversity in the ways we think about African literature, right?
Absolutely.
When we talk about African literature, like you said at the beginning, half the time we're referring to fiction. We're not even referring to poetry, right? Not to mention nonfiction. I remember I read this collection that you published, that you edited, Safe House. And I still remember reading the introduction in which you were lamenting the fact that there isn't enough African creative nonfiction, right? That was just a few years ago.
It was, and let me tell you that one of the books you featured is Bongani Kona's anthology on death and dying.
Yeah.
For me, it was incredibly moving to see somebody moving into a space that is so universal. Also because, the writer is somebody who I have worked with and indeed was featured in Safe House anthology. That's what I wanted. I wanted that kind of workshop in that book to encourage people to go and do their own. And we've seen, various anthologies. But for me, the fact that you have nonfiction anthologies in this list, and really excellent ones, on subjects that maybe one couldn't have guessed at, is really exciting to me. And I think that's it's a brilliant example.
Yeah, that too. We've come past, the years when people are lamenting about poverty porn, about a certain kind of narrow idea of what African literature is, to this list that celebrates just the sheer staggering diversity of African writing. And for me, I think a book that represents that beautifully is Slahi's book, The Actual True Story of Zarga and Ahmed. This is a book, is a Mauritanian fiction, right? I mean, who would have thought that we will be reading in English Mauritanian novel, and one that is so delightful, that is suffused with magic, that explores kind of the immersive, magical space of the Sahara Desert as a site of storytelling, that explores the animal experience, that just does this beautiful, beautiful things. For many Anglophone African readers, this will be their first time reading a Mauritanian novel. And to me, that's awfully special.
And if you think about books as a way to travel, think of all the places we haven't yet traveled because, those books weren't available to us. And that makes me incredibly happy. And if you also think about, someone like Ben Okri turning his eye to children's books and what that can do, the magic that comes out of somebody who has the soul of a poet, writing for children. And I have to say that for me, as a self-confessed science fiction nerd, the abundance of science fiction is something that, one, I feel sorry for my 18, 15, 20-year-old self who didn't have those books. So I'm now having to catch up. And one of the things it's meant is that I'm now having to learn about young adult fiction because so much of the stuff that I want to read is being written for YA, and that's, there's nothing but joy in being exposed to a new book. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but my book of the year is definitely Namina Forna's The Gilded
You've
Ones.
been talking about that book all over the place.
I cannot stop.
I've heard you're officially obsessed.
I am such a fangirl, and I promise she's not paying me. She hasn't sent me a Mercedes or anything. But
what do you like about the book? What do you find captivating about it?
There is an assuredness and a confidence about owning the space that I really loved. And when I had a conversation with her, she was talking about having been as a child in a situation of war, basically in a country at war, and how this fed into her imagination when she wanted to write speculative fiction. I love it because it centers the lives of young women, looks at the way that we harm young women's bodies and spirits and reclaims the power. It's the kind of book that one would want to give to any young woman or young girl in their care whom they love. But mostly it's about that kind of, this belongs to me. And she's taken YA speculative fiction and infused it with traditions and cosmologies from her own experience and from other African experiences. It's basically everything I've ever wanted. And I think it's unfair to pull out that one book. But I think the reason I want to do that is because it epitomizes so much of what we're talking about. And we can see with the other science fiction anthologies that are being published on the continent with writers that kind of give us a Pan-African voice. That to me is also incredibly, I'm saying exciting too much, but that's really how I feel.
But it is exciting. And I think definitely the idea that these stories are captivating global audiences, but they are very much rooted in an African cosmology. These writers, though they are so young, they are dipping into mythology, cosmologies, philosophies, that are centered on the African world. This is something that sometimes I feel that Achebe, Shoyinka, that they dreamed of, that they could not really name as what they wanted, but that we are seeing younger writers doing effortlessly, where they are inviting the world to partake of African storytelling, and they're writing it in a language that anybody anywhere in the world can connect to and enjoy. I think that's beautiful.
Absolutely. It's a language, it's an English that's very inflected with whatever home language they're talking about.
Right.
And I mean, it's the other example I wanted to bring up was A Blood Condition, because we're talking about this generational shift. And one of the things that really struck me about that aspect of it was someone like Kaya Chingonyi, who is a beautiful poet, is writing about a crisis, the HIV/AIDS crisis, that started when I was a teenager, but he's writing the next generation on. And for me, that's really precious because there's a period of reflection that goes into it, but it's also coming from one who is of the place. And that, I think that makes a big difference. Yeah,
you're right. So the idea that, he's removed from the generation, right? It's about what does it mean to exist in relationship to this thing that happened in the past, right? But filtering it through my own eyes. And I mean, it makes me think about one way to name what's special about the writing that we're seeing today, right? Because many times we don't think of African writing as historical in a way that we should. So for instance, when I think about the long history of African fiction, of modern African fiction, right? Because there's been fiction on the continent for thousands of years. When we think of modern African fiction, I like to kind of go back to maybe a book like Thomas Mofolo's Chaka, he was writing in 1907, right? So imagine that we've had 100 years of African writers writing, but most importantly, African writers reading other African writers, right? Achebe did not have a ton of African writers to read. We don't, think about what that means. But that many of these young writers writing, they have read a ton of African writers. And so there's a way that that historical perspective gives them a certain kind of confidence and desire for exploration, experimentation that, we may not have seen in earlier writings. And so, a novel like, what's her name? Efwa Traore's Children of the Quicksand, which is about a little girl who leaves Lagos and goes to her grandmother's Yoruba village and gets caught up in this, drama between Orishas. That's so what it means to kind of co-opt, embrace a culture, but do it in a way that is not self-serving, is not self-conscious. It just feels real and feels right.
I love the way that you've pinpointed the fact that reading other African writers who've come before them have given confidence, because I think that's what I meant about it being sort of a natural confidence. It's the same thing as, you will have experienced something similar as somebody who grew up in an African country moving to the United States. And, I remember feeling like, well, I knew all of their books and I also knew my own books. And there's this wonderful feeling of ownership or of feeling confident because you know that others like you have done something before. And I think that in itself is really magical. But I wonder how you feel about the various themes that the authors have decided to tackle and, where the stories are set. Did you and your team find that there were certain parts of the world that were publishing extraordinarily well? There's always a complaint that every list has too many Nigerians, but then again, there are more of you than there are the rest of us, so that's okay.
It's the goal of any curator of African content, especially literature, is to fight against the Nigerian colonization.
We have to step up our game. I don't think anyone should fight against it.
And I think as a Nigerian too, I'm doubly self-conscious about that because, I want to make sure that I'm not kind of just working from this space of my comfort zone. So we are very intentional about national representation, right? Because yes, statistically, Nigerians and South Africans are publishing lots of the books that make waves. Okay, so if we were going to look at celebrities only for this list, it will be, I'm talking 60% Nigerians and South Africans. But thankfully, that's not the rule or the only rule that we use to include books. National diversity is also very important. So that we literally have a list where we have the countries and the books, and we're always kind of moving things around so that as many different countries can exist within that space. Because a list for me is a community of books of writers. And if they're not diverse, they're just not interesting. So making sure that we represent so-called small places on the continent, to me, is very important. And also another thing that kind of drives the decisions that we make are kind of the topics that people cared about all through the year. So for instance, speculative fiction was huge this year. Everybody and their mother was publishing speculative fiction. There were events around speculative fiction. There was it was all over the place. So we knew early on that this is a trend that we wanted to represent on the list. And also everyone who is in the African literary world witnessed the whole debacle between Akwa Emezi and Adichie around the question of queer experiences. So we also knew that, look, that's something that we wanted to make sure that we represented in the list, that African readers care about the representation of queer lives and the unsilencing of queer lives within African writing. It's mattered to people this year in a way that was hard to ignore. So we made sure that in looking at books that we were kind of also tracking this kinds of trends and questions and debates that inspired people in terms of what they read and what they talked about.
That kind of engagement that you're describing, I think, happens when we reach the point of volume that we've been talking about, where there's right. a number of books. I think that, you know, even though I lament the direction that some of these conversations takes, I still really value the fact that books are sparking such passionate feelings.
Right.
And, you know, there's the sense that, you know, I'm always wary of the discussion of a community, mostly because I'm an editor. I'm mostly in a quiet room by myself, reading or editing. But, you know, it's really important that you talk about that community, because it's those of us who are reading and making all of this work. And that sense of this is our space and not waiting for somebody else to dictate what conversations take place in that space, I think is something that I appreciate year on year going on. And, you know, I'm glad that you've sort of broken down the different things that come into making a list such as this, because I know certainly from experience just how hard it is and how you always will be told you've missed something out. But that's the magic of it.
Yes.
Because somebody else can make a list, you know, and somebody
right.
from, so, you know, then we have another list, and that's great.
I think that that's great. And one thing that people don't realize is that a list is actually as powerful, or is defined not just by what is included, but by what is left out.
Yes.
So pointing that something was left out is actually, it's good to point it out, because it's part of what a list does. It creates this artificial boundary, and then it allows people to then say, oh, this is in there, this is in there. And that in itself is creating other kinds of lists itself. I was losing my mind in the last few days before we ended, you know, we finished up the list about, you know, I'm having trouble removing this, adding this. And then I went on the comment section for the New York Times 100 notable books of the year. I mean, when I read the comment, I was like, you know what? We're good, because you can't please everybody. You know, so just put your list out there and hope that it creates conversations that matters. But, you know, Ellah, I wanted us to maybe talk about what things, what holes or problems or stress points in the culture does the list expose? Because we've been celebratory, you know, about how, you know, amazing the scene is, the market is, but that's not the full picture, in the sense that this list also shows that there are ways in which we need to think differently, plan differently, work differently. What would you say are things that we should keep in mind in that vein?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. I mean, one of the things that feels really important to me is what you were talking about at the beginning, when we were sort of, you know, going through our initial responses to the list and thinking about the countries represented and everything. And my response to you was that we have to acknowledge that this is the result of us doing years of work. And by us, I mean this community we're talking about doing that work. My concern is that we continue to be strategic and not just allow this moment of kind of euphoria, as in, oh, look, there are these wonderful books and it's only 50 out of however many this year. You know, there is point for celebration, but we can't rest on that. I think that the hard work still has to continue, because I don't feel like we're in a secure enough position. Let me give you an example. When I started working in publishing a couple of years on, at least in the United Kingdom, there was a moment where, you know, that wonderful anthology NW2 was published, and Diana Evans was publishing, I think, Half of a Yellow Sun was just coming out. There was that moment in time. A lot of those writers, you know, not the ones I've mentioned, but a lot of other writers fell along the wayside because marketing wasn't put for those books or publicity put for those books. And what I wanted to say about this list is that we take this encouragement at this volume, at the range of themes, at the range of approaches in genre and so on, and we celebrate it. But we also need to make sure that we're cementing the processes that result in the publication of these books. And so my great wariness, and it may be weird me saying this because I work in England and I work for, a Scottish and English publisher part-time, but the one thing that is of concern to me is how are we bolstering the literary experience of readers on the continent as well as the diaspora.
Yeah.
And that also includes the bolstering of publishing houses, however that may work. And one of the good things to know is that many of these writers are now in a position to insist that their books have to be published by a publisher in their home country as well,
Right.
which is something that becomes increasingly important. And, if you think about things like Washuka's big book, what's it called? Book bank project in Nigeria with libraries, where it's not about come and donate to us, but let us rebuild our libraries and stock them in a way that ensures that the writers are also being recompensed for those library reads. I think all of these things are pointing to us reaching, I don't know if critical mass is the right phrase to use, but certainly in terms of the writing is that critical mass, but the other things that have to match with it, and not least the role of critical responses such as Brittle Paper, the Lagos Review, so many other reviews that have come up in the last few years. I think those are the things that are concerning me. I don't want it to be a moment where we sit back, because I don't want in 10 years' time for us to think, oh, that was a nice moment. It's a shame it's all over.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, could you maybe talk a little bit about what this shift is, right? Why is African literature doing comparatively well today, right? We understand that we are still not doing as well as we should. This is a continent of, it's still the amount of books that we are talking about still doesn't represent, the kind of the expansive nature of the continent itself. Mm-hmm. But comparatively, right, we are doing quite well. But what is it about this moment? Why? What's special?
Okay. What is special? I think that 2023 is going to be the bumper year, because 2023, I'm saying that in answer to your question, because the books that we're seeing now that are listed now would have been commissioned a year ago, 2 years ago. So there is that. And I think that there's been so much more commissioning happening right now, speaking from an acquiring editor's point of view, that 23 is going to be bumper. One of the things that your question is about what my anxieties are, or why this moment.
Why this moment? And the reason I'm asking that is because, so that we know what to hold on to, what to kind of to strengthen, right?
Okay.
So that we kind of know moving forward, how do we ensure that the shift taking place is systemic as opposed to just being cultural, right? Because it's not the first time that the world has loved African literature, that we've been the darling of the global, literary world, and something happened and we fell off the wagon. How can we ensure that this trend that we are seeing just keeps going up and up and up and up, that African literature continues to expand?
I think we can look to the past to see at which points in time did we celebrate and then it all fell short, and what were the problems then. From a publisher's perspective, the problems were around marketing and sales. Just do these books go into a special section, or are they pushed towards readers of that particular book rather than readers of African fiction?
Right.
So you can tell I'm getting passionate because my hands start moving all over the place, but this is really true. One of the reasons I think that we're on the way to solving that particular issue is the number of people of color in general who are now working in publishing. So now, for example, if I go to a publishing event here in London, there used to be, not so long ago, I was famous for always leaving first because I just got tired of being the only Black person in the room. Now there's just like, I went to the Women's Prize recently and there were all these young Black people. Right. And I was just like standing there beaming, like I'd given birth to them all, but working in many, many different departments. And at the same time as that's happening in our bit of the diaspora, I know that there is so much work being done by colleagues in different countries on the continent that is ensuring that not only are these books being published out of London or New York, but they're also being published out of Johannesburg, Lagos, and, as much as possible. So people doing work in Cameroon, in Ethiopia, in so many different places, this claiming of a literary heritage, but also this taking hold of a literary future. I think all of those things make a difference. And I actually can't answer your question about what are the different things that have brought this moment to come. I think we can both list things that we suspect. My way of thinking right now is to just thank their ancestors for this moment in time and to be really careful in looking to see what happened the last 10 years. What work did I do? What work did you do? What did our colleagues do? The work of people running festivals like the AK Festival, the South African festivals, all of those things that, the work being done in East Africa by Jalada in Kenya, by Louise Ntomni in Rwanda and in Uganda, all of those things together, I think, ensure a forward trajectory if we keep a hold of it.
Right. And also, to think about what small indie presses on the continent are doing. I know in Nigeria, for a fact, there are small presses popping up, but these presses are struggling. They are working against a very tough economic context, but they are there publishing books, right? For example, The Madhouse by T.J. Benson, this just absolutely gorgeous family drama was published by Masobe Books in Abuja, right? So we need more of this kinds of infrastructural shifts that allows us to actually kind of, be at the center of the means of production.
Absolutely.
There's actually one question that we could take, Ellah, so hold your thoughts before we move on. We have a question on Instagram that says, how can we encourage local libraries to purchase more of the books on the 2021 list? And then we have a similar question that was asked on YouTube about, how can you get publishers to, how can you get local libraries wherever you are to buy these books? First of all, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. We'll be happy to answer them. And to respond to this question, it's a very good question because libraries are actually one of the ways that you distribute books, that you get books into the hands of readers. And so it's easy. Simply ask your local library to order the books. That's something that people don't realize, that local library acquisition people are always looking for impactful books to buy. So if you walk up to your library and say, there's this book that I really want us to get, the chances are that they're going to be able to get them because, they know that they have a dedicated reader. Okay, so that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. Let me see if there is.
Could I add to that answer, Ainehi? Just a quick thing to add is that along with the local libraries, because I don't know how they work in different countries. I know that in different spaces, I gave the example of Kenya, but Patina Gapa in Zimbabwe did a similar thing where she raised funds for the Harare Library. And I think that people should not underestimate the power of that kind of grassroots movement. I have to say that I don't believe in the donation of books because I think it kills a local industry, often when it hasn't even had time to start. But what I do believe in is groups of friends. And I think I saw this on a trip to China, where groups of friends will gather together and pool their books and have, sort of a local library and pool their money to buy these books and sort of go together. And there are all of those kinds of initiatives that are, I guess what I'm trying to say in all of these things is that focusing on the business side of it is as important as the cultural side of it, because that commercial imperative is the only thing that's going to ensure longevity. It's really important. Yeah.
Right. That books at the end of the day are kind of plugged into a certain kind of, capital, global capital, right? That's so it's important to think about how can we compete or inhabit that space in a way that ensures that our books continue to thrive. Ellah, there are lots of people who like to think through this dichotomy between books published in the West and books published on the continent. And there are arguments that many times the way we think about African books today is very much clouded by what the big 5 publishing companies are publishing. And that many of these books are also written by diaspora people. And in putting this list together, we were very self-conscious about that, because we've had criticisms over the years that we tend to privilege books that are published outside of the continent, as opposed to digging deep and looking for local Africa's based publishers to include in the list. What do you think of that? This kind of separation or divide between African literature as it exists in the West and African literature as it exists on the continent?
It's interesting. Somebody asked me if for the Caine Prize, for example, the AKO Caine Prize, we could tell where a story had been edited and published, and my answer was that actually the subject matter and the writing style is not going to tell you that. Occasionally the editing might tell you that. I think that it's undeniable that there's a difference, because the writer's experience is going to be different depending on where they live. I think it's a really important challenge that you guys faced head on, because actually it is really important not to privilege those stories that are easily accessible. The body of work is in digging really deep and finding out what the smaller presses are doing, especially in the age that we live in. You can't get there's no excuse for ignorance, because the information is there, or the people are there to ask. And I think that that's where this kind of list becomes really important, not just in its entirety this year, but over the years. It's showing that balance. And one of the reasons about the privileging of works published in the diaspora goes back to what I was saying about the commercial imperative, goes back to that, how are these books marketed and therefore disseminated? And a publisher based in a capital, even of a large country such as Nigeria, may not have access to the same things, but the readers can talk about it. And so you go onto Instagram, and I know I'm always seeing book covers of books that I didn't know existed, and I have to put on my wish list immediately. So I think that it's something that's a constant conversation, and I think it has to remain one. But we can't, I guess the only thing I'd be wary of is not to penalize the writers who are writing out of a diaspora. I don't think we're in danger of that, but it's something that I want to watch out for as well.
Right.
Because both African experiences are important. Those stories are equally important. And it's about how we bolster the publishing that's coming from African countries and Africa-based publishers that becomes really important to me.
Right. I mean, thinking about how platforms, can aid the circulation of books is key. I remember in 2017 looking through New York Times 100 notable books. And I went there because I wanted to see what African books made the list. And there were like 3 or something like that. And I was so disappointed because I was going to make some post about it. Oh, 7 African authors honored in. And then I just said, but why do I do that? Why do I slavishly every year go to this one list and hope that African writers are represented? Why don't we just make our own list? You know,
That's exactly
and
what I
that's
mean,
how
yeah.
this list came into being, is that, you know, I just got frustrated at the breadcrumbs every year. It just seemed demeaning, you know, that every year I go and I celebrate the 1 to 3 authors on the New York Times list, right? And that's so creating African platforms are very important. In putting this list together, you know, I found Cheeky Natives is a podcast based in Johannesburg. I mean,
Yes.
what they have done, you know, in terms of reviewing African books, in terms of giving writers a platform is phenomenal. Like, there is no other, I mean, I can't think of an African literary space without the work that Cheeky Natives is doing. That's so part of kind of investing in a sustainable future for African literature is about investing in this kinds of platform spaces that can enable us to control the spaces of visibility for our work.
I think that's so important. It really is. And if you think about sort of looking through this long list and the great variety you have, and that whole idea you were pointing out about thinking about diversity, not as something that puts us in the position of having to be one out, being the diverse person, as it were, but diversity amongst ourselves, thinking about the richness of the languages, the cultures, the memories, the dreams that make up a book such as this becomes really important in terms of the wider ecosystem, as you say, that's going to support it.
Yeah.
Really important, yeah.
We are getting to the end of our conversation. I can't believe that things, you know, that the time has moved so fast. But before we go, I wanted to just have you comment briefly on the fact that there are lots of women publishing today, you know, that I think it's special, but it's a trend that I don't think that we are acknowledging enough, that there seems to be some kind of shift in some kind of shift happening where African literature is becoming more women-centered. Am I just imagining things?
No, you're not imagining things. You know, anything to do with the promotion of women is something that we need to celebrate. At the same time, I would also, one of the things that I think about as a publisher is that, you know, I have this bookshelf, which goes down there, but there's certain categories that are not yet filled. And one of the things that I certainly want more of is more of the experience of young Black men, because their grandfathers I know about, because I can find enough books to read written by their grandfathers. Their fathers, not so much, but contemporary African male. I mean, we have Caleb Azuma Nelson's Open Water here, which is one of the strongest books I've read in a very, very long time. And so the books by women are brilliant, because I think we learn so much about a culture through the things that women tend to write about in higher volume than men. And that's about the family, the hearth, and, you know, the becoming a woman, all of those things, which tell you so much about a society and a culture. I think that's really, really important. But somehow I think it's easier, and I have to be really careful saying this, but let's just say I'm starting a conversation. Somehow I think that it's kind of easier for African women to sneak in stealthily and write quite devastating works, because people, I guess, are not as afraid of us as they are often of African men. And so I think as a publisher, I'm certainly on the lookout to make sure that I'm balancing that out as much. I'd love for people to argue with me. So, you know, argue with me if you want to. prove me wrong. But, I have to say that that's something that's been a concern of mine for several years now, is making sure that those voices from the young men are heard as much. But also, I don't know if we can hear enough from African women. I really don't, wherever they're writing from, because we're talking about centuries of other people trying to tell our stories. And the fact that, these daughters of Africa are now claiming that space in a more powerful way than ever before is, as you say, something for us to celebrate.
Right. And a space that has been erased for decades, right? So it's still an attempt to diversify the communities of texts that we are creating. We are almost at our limit. So I'm just going to ask you one last question. As we move into next year, what is one book that you're really looking forward to coming out?
Oh, wow. That's not fair. You can't ask for just one.
All right. If you want to reel through a few, feel free.
I'm really looking forward to Novalet Bulawayo's new book. I've been waiting since We Need New Names for that. And I got a galley recently. This is another Christmas read for me. So I think that's going to be really, really exciting. I'm trying to read my way throughout all of Akwaeke Emeze, but they keep writing more books and I keep thinking running to keep up. And so I'm looking forward to, one, catching up with their work, but to read what's next. I think next year I'm also looking for, there are a couple of sort of history books that are taking a look at history of British Empire, but from the perspective of young Black historians. And, there are just a couple of those that I'm really looking forward to reading, because that's even, it goes as close to what, academic writing for the general reader can be. And I think that kind of historical research. So that's a trend that's really making me excited, as in the submissions I'm seeing coming through. And there may be a few more years coming up. But more than anything, I'm now going to have to make a list of all of the books on your list that I haven't read. Thankfully, I've read a good chunk of them, and catch up before you do your next list.
Yeah, and in January, first week of January, we are publishing the anticipated books of the year. Last year, it was the 55 book list. This year, we are going to see how much we are going, we can come up with, but the list is already pretty long. But stay tuned. You get like a nice little spread of, books that we're all looking forward to. Ellah, this has been wonderful. Thank you for taking your time to chat with me about books. Thanks to the Africa Center for making this space and for all their support all through the curation of the list and the publicity around the list. It's really special that we have organizations like this, that support the work that we do. Thanks to everybody at home for joining us.
I want to thank you for your work and for these focal points during the year that bring us all so much joy and so much conversation. I think it makes a big difference. And to our audience, go and buy the books.
Go and buy them. Go and buy them. There are buy links. When you go to the page, there are buy links that takes you directly to where to get them. Every book on there has a buy link. So please support the authors, support the publishers, and share the list with your friends and family. That's the supporting these writers and publishers financially is part of the cultural work that we need to do to get African literature where it needs to be. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ellah.
Bye-bye.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us. The stories that shape us. And the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us. The ones that hold us down. the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.